Hello everyone, the Dahlia's beta just started and I know a lot of people are wondering, does she save break and who does she replace? Which I have the team calculations in the second half of the video. That said, let's get right into it, starting by looking at her skill. When casting the skill, Constance does an attack and also creates a zone. For the next 3 turns, the team gains 50% break efficiency, which is great, but the kicker is actually this right here. Toughness damage taken while the enemy is not broken will still deal super break damage. Now this is freaking crazy, but the wording doesn't really tell the whole story. Now from a damage perspective, this is a crazy buff, but it is a bit difficult to calculate the increase as it will vary from situation to situation. As such, we can just use this formula. Firstly, you will need to figure out what percentage uptime you had pre-Dahlia, which you can just measure in rotations. Using my example, we can see that it took us 2 rotations to set up, and then 3 rotations while dealing damage, so 60% uptime. So dividing our new uptime over old, we'll get the final damage increase. In some cases, like against past present, you'll break in 1 turn and deal damage for like 7, so it'd be a tiny increase. But against enemies with multi-toughnesses like Lygus, it could be double or even triple your current damage. And with this alone, I think she's already a must pull for break. She's kind of like Kafka, where if the super break multipliers from Trailblazer or Fugue enable the super break playstyle, she now enables break. Now the next thing which isn't stated is that you now deal damage when enemies are weakness protected. So basically, break doesn't have any more weaknesses. The Arumaton, Soulglad Monkey, and any APOC Shadow Boss, it doesn't matter. And this is intended as there's even achievement for it. Something funny though is that break still does have one more counter, which a viewer of mine pointed out. If the enemy doesn't have toughness, then you can't deal super break damage. As for the final implication of this new mechanic, for Firefly and Rappa, we really don't care about break delay anymore as we perma do damage. And weakness break efficiency is now less valuable as we don't need it anymore to deal damage. But it still is a pretty big damage increase due to the super break multiplier and also Rappa's talent. Boothill, however, while he does benefit from this skill as well, his talent doesn't proc on unbroken enemies, so we still need something like Ron May. Moving on, we're gonna look at her talent next. She gains 35 energy at the start of battle, letting her 1 turn ult, which is really important as we'll later see. But for what we want to focus on, 1. She marks an ally and herself as the dance partners, who now gain a 60% super break multiplier. 2. Constance will now launch a bounce follow-up attack anytime the ally attacks. Now, while this does have a very high super break multiplier, it's actually not going to do too much because the toughness damage is pretty low at 15. So we're mostly here for the energy and that little bit of toughness. Just know, E2 Firefly and other stuff can't abuse this as it will require her turn again to gain another charge, just like Kafka. With this though, we can now move to her ult. This is a 130 cost attack which distributes its attack across all enemies. What matters though is that toughness, which is 30 and is actually really high, on paper. Apparently, it also distributes its toughness damage across all enemies, which is not good, so it's actually pretty low, especially in an AoE scenario. So hopefully they'll buff this, but I don't really know. At the same time, she inflicts wilt on all enemies without needing effect hit rate, and enemies with wilt lose 18% defense and also are weakness implanted with Dahlia's and her partner's element. While this is pretty nice for Firefly and Boothill, it's especially impactful for someone like Rappa as she can now have 100% efficiency due to matching elements. Also, anyone now can use the Kopogni set, which is also pretty cool. Now, as powerful as this ult is, it still is a 130 cost ult, so let's see how her rotations are. If we do a 3-turn rotation, we can get the ult 100% of the time, with the ideal combo being skill basic, letting us also be SP positive. You could also overkill with tutorial, but that's up to you. Now, as for 2-turn rotations, she actually can 2-turn ult, assuming she launches 3 follow-up attacks, but it'll be up to your rotation. I'd say generally don't expect it to happen though. However, if you decide to use tutorial, you can guarantee a 2-turn ult with a double skill, or skill basic if you get hit once. So when it comes to energy, Constance is actually just fine, which is super nice. Now if you were paying attention, you may have noticed this 13 energy. This comes from her Trace 3. When allies implant a weakness, she gains 30 speed for 2 turns, which I know for Boothill mains will help them reach that 200 speed breakpoint. By the way, Constance's ult does not give this buff to her partner and they have to implant the weakness themselves. So sorry Rapid mains, you don't get this. As for the second part though, if you're a fire unit and trigger this effect, you'll gain 10% of your max energy, with this effect stopping once they hit 50% energy. Now this is a godsend for Firefly, as of the 3 break units, she was the only one who legitimately had energy issues. Now, this effect, while not stated, works even when the enemy already has the weakness or is already weakness implanted. So as long as the move has an implant like Firefly's skill, you will get these buffs. As for the remaining 2 traces, Hurt Trace 2 makes her even more SP positive. And if you decide to run a sustain on a team, the Trace 1 will give you around 100 break effect. It's just like Finon's Trace and really helps out the sustain players, bridging the gap between sustainless. Personally, I wish they gave like 120 to players with a sustain and a little bit to those without. Regardless, this does make using someone like Lingsha more appealing. Before we move to the team stuff, we're just gonna quickly look at the vertical investment. Her Lightcone gives 60% break effect to herself, and that oh so coveted break damage bonus, which I was asking for in my previous video. Also, here's my bingo card from it, and low-key got a lot of the stuff I was asking for. Now, this is a straight up 32% damage increase for her and her partner, which is a bit stronger than the usual support Lightcones, which probably hover around 20%. Still, let's just look at a comparison versus the other options. Using my build for an E0 S1 Firefly with Lingsha and Raw Mei, which has high vulnerability but low defense shred, the results look like this. As we can see, Holiday expectedly performs the worst, with the other options also lagging quite a bit behind. However, if we decide to max out on defense shred using Fugue and Dahlia, the results now look like this. Now, the defense shred Lightcones are very competitive with her signature, with Cypher's just being slightly behind. Now, depending on how much vulnerability there is, Fugue's Lightcone will gain or lose value. So it's definitely a nice Lightcone to have, especially with the SP refund, but it's not a must pull or your account is bricked. As for E1, everyone now gets that 60% super break multiplier, with the DPS and also Dahlia getting 40% more. The interesting part is actually the second half, where your dance partner's first attack against the enemy will reduce their toughness by 25%. Now, the wording is also a bit weird as it says this resets after the enemy receives a killing blow, but TLDR, it works when a boss switches phases. Now, while it sounds really good on paper, I actually think it's not as good as some people may believe. Firstly, in a break team, where the hyper carry is still dealing a majority of the damage, giving 60% super break to everyone else doesn't really help that much. And in a sustainless team with HMC and Fugue, it'll just be a 12.12% increase for the carry. However, if you do run a sustain with something like Fugue and Constance, it will be around 19%. Secondly, we don't even need to break the enemy anymore to deal damage. While yes, you get perks like better sustain because they can't act, or faster access to the broken enemy multiplier, it's just not really needed. And third, this will only really help assuming you can delete the boss in that one rotation, which yes, MOC and the night bosses will likely just insta-die, but against extremely tanky enemies like the king fights, it's just not that good, as you'd likely take multiple rotations, while this would only proc a few times. By the way, from what I've seen, this additional 25% also doesn't count towards super break damage. So as of now, I think if you had to choose between E1 or S1, I think S1 will be the way to go, with the SP comfort and just higher overall damage. Hopefully E1 does get a bit buffed to where all your attacks deal an additional like 10% toughness, but as of now, I don't believe it's the best. Now to the second half of the video. Which character should be replacing who? Now originally, I broke down all our supports and DPSs, seeing what stats tier were oversaturated and just finding the best combination of supports. And then I remembered I could just use a calculator. With Firefly, she's the simplest of the bunch. No funny gimmicks or stacks, just attack and deal damage. The most optimal team will simply have the highest numbers. Rappa, while relying on her talent a bit more, will have the exact same results as Firefly. With our 5 supports, we get 10 different team combinations, so here's the damage numbers. Now I'll just be going through the conclusions that can be drawn. 1. From a raw damage amp in Sustainless, Constance is only better in one variation, that being one with all super break multipliers and no Raw Mei. Second is that generally, Harmony Trailblazer and Fugue have nearly identical performances, with the best performing teams being with those two together, so no Elation MC or RMC for us. And third, Raw Mei is the one that's ideally being replaced, but you can replace any of them depending on the scenario. If you need to break the boss, Raw Mei Constance. Raw damage, run Constance with either Fugue or Harmony Trailblazer. Now from these charts, we can also see if that trace one was that impactful. Prior to Constance, the jump from Sustain to Sustainless was a 71% damage increase. But with Constance on the team, it's only a 50% increase. So yeah, that trace one actually goes super hard. Finally, when looking at the numbers, we can see that Constance is not that crazy of a damage increase in the normal sense. Instead of the damage coming from raw amp, it's instead via the permanent damage window. So it may be as low as a say 20% damage increase to as much as triple or quadruple your current damage. While damage per screenshot is relatively the same, damage per action value is drastically increased. As such, I'd say for all three break carries, she's a must, and you could just use my chart to find out your best team. However, I do want to quickly go over an issue with Boothill. Boothill needs enemy broken to activate his talent, which is a decent amount of damage. This means he ideally runs Raw Mei as he still needs that break efficiency and delay, unlike Firefly and Rappa. But as you saw, whether sustained or not, it is the worst performing team in terms of damage. But it's not the biggest deal as Boothill does delete toughness bars, but it's still something to consider. Now with the kit and best teams now broken down, I can give my take as we all should be on the same page. I would say, as a unit, Constance has zero issues and is honestly perfect, doing what she needs to do. However, I don't think it's good enough. Let's just highball it and say we've doubled our current damage per action value for break teams. I think for most low and best players, like with 4 to 5 costs, doubling their damage may not be enough. Low cost Firefly or Rappa mains with a sustain is likely taking 4 to 5 cycles right now in MOC, if not more for other players. So with Constance, we could cut that to around half, so 2 cycles. And that's not bad at all for low cost, but then you remember that the Remembrance team can do the same thing and 0 cycle plus some overkill. If you go sustainless, it will be a very competitive team. But then you remember that Dahlia isn't balanced around that, which really sucks. It's why I asked her to have some sustain in my previous video. The other issue is that we're about to enter a new version, with 4.0 right around the corner. And every time we've went to a new version, from 1.6 to 2.0 or 2.8 to 3.0, there was a massive HP inflation and power creep for our units. So while Dahlia can push break back into maybe tier 0.5, if power creep happens again, then they're gonna face the same thing that happened with Herda. For an analogy, it's like break got a 95 on the final project. That's great and all, but because they were failing so badly, they quite literally needed a 120 to even pass the class. Well, I think she's perfectly fine with the current kit, break as a whole isn't. Constance for them isn't a must because she's OP, albeit she is. She's a must for them because break right now is just really weak. I really do think she needs further buffs to keep break relevant in 4.x, perhaps some slight higher multipliers or even her own toughness damage. If not, the sustainless guy will probably be okay for another year, while low cost users may need to give up on break again. If you want to know if she's worth pulling or not, just look at it from the perspective of your team. Ask yourself, is doubling or tripling your current damage enough? If it isn't, low-key may just want to give up on break and save for 4.x units. Personally, I am pulling for E0S1 and hopefully I'll get some Eidolons along the way. Now on the screen should be some footage of my Firefly nuke. I have a pretty high cost team and damage has never really been an issue, so expanding that damage window is gonna be great. But having seen my friends low cost Firefly struggle back in 2.8 versus Farog, I don't think Dahlia is saving up. That's why I'm saying she really needs to be OP to have those players keep up. If not, they might be okay for maybe 1 to 2 break show endgame cycles, but then they're just gonna be cooked again. As for the question, does she save break? I think she does, but only for some players right now. And yeah, that's the whole video. I don't have too much else to say, but you should totally check out my previous video on break because I think the point still stands. I was hoping they didn't go this direction with Constance by expanding the damage window, but instead by increasing our damage by an insane amount in the time. But either way, it still reaches the same results. Besides that, thank you for watching and I hope this helped. Peace!